we are uncomfortable with grief, and so we get scared to hold that space. I'm so curious what your thoughts are on that.
I agree. Like overall, I think it's just our own discomfort. And like I think there's something unique that does happen when you've been through grief because I had a unique story that like one of my best friends in undergrad had lost his dad to cancer just 4 months before mine died. And I distinctly remember like handling that really badly as his friend, like in retrospect. Like, I kinda avoided it. I tried to keep him busy. I certainly spent the time, but I felt like a lot of people did of, like, I don't know what to say. And it was so interesting after my dad passed. I'm like, "Oh, saying anything minus, like, placating of, like" yeah, kinda like you mentioned, "They're in a better place," or this and that. Um, Saying anything is usually better than nothing. And there's individual differences and, each unique person, again, could want something different.
This is Dr. Laura. Welcome to Mind Candy Podcast, where we empower women's voices and tackle current issues related to psychology.
Hey everyone, it's Dr. Laura with Mind Candy. We are back for another episode. Today I am going to be talking to Dr. Justin, and he is of a modern therapist. So a lot of you probably know him. Take it away, Dr. Justin.
Yo, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Awesome. We're going to be talking about something that I think both professionally and personally, you and I have talked about before that we really kind of connect into the topic, which is, I think, something that a lot of people work with. And, we work with a lot of people on this topic, and it's grief. It's something that I think this one word means a lot to a lot of different people. And today we're going to talk about, our clinical and maybe a little bit of our personal perspectives of how we kind of work with people on the topic of grief and kind of how maybe someone could start having that conversation with themselves or a trusted clinician.
Yeah, yeah, it's such an important topic. I know on social media, I share a lot about my experiences with grief. And I've been surprised over the years of making content how that vulnerability so many people can connect with. Because grief is one of those things, like if we live long enough, all of us are eventually gonna have the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most people listening probably have lost something or someone. When we think of grief, it's really like a natural process, right? To lose someone or something. It happens in all of our lives. It's something I think we try to avoid, but it's something
Mhm.
that is unavoidable. And I think when we think of grief, I'm curious what you think of when you hear the word grief.
Yeah, I think of the the naturalness of loss that we do experience, as you just mentioned, of, we can grieve things that we've had and we can grieve things we've never had. And I think that's something when we dive into grief a lot, people, for example, will be like, well, my father passed away and I never had a relationship with him. And so I sort of grieve the loss of not having a father figure like, my friends or TV shows or all these other things. So I think sometimes we can grieve what we haven't had, but for many of us it's a relationship, it's a connection, it's whether it's an animal or a person or a job, it's something that made our lives really meaningful. And then when we don't have it anymore, the range of emotions and meaning making that come after that are really profound and not linear.
Mhm. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think that we think of grief, and at least I think of grief, and maybe some people listening think of a grief and we think of death, right?
Yeah.
And that can be physical death. That
Mhm.
can be, a loss of a pet or a parent or a spouse or a friend. It can also mean a lot of different things. It can be, like you said, something that you never did have. It
Mhm.
can be, you know, it can be an illness that's chronic. It can be a divorce. It can be a breakup. It can be any other kind of significant loss that we have. And I think that another big thing to talk about is that it affects not just our emotional state like we see as psychologists, but it also affects our, physical state. It affects our bodies. A lot of work that I know you and I both do is with, trauma and mood and, disorders like, anxiety and depression. And it's so interesting, I think, we think of the emotional aspects of grief and the cognitive aspects of grief, but there's also a lot of physical pain associated with it. I'm wondering what you see associated that way in your practice when you're working with clients with all those different types.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even personally, when my brother died of an opioid overdose, I experienced that for many years. I was having a lot of GI problems that I'd never had before. I was, I was basically one of those people who could eat out of a trash can like a raccoon. That's how all my friends knew me. And I was totally fine. And then after my brother passed away, it's like, yeah, I had a lot of sensitivities and things going on, and it was directly a result, and when it started, it was directly a result of my brother passing away. So I think for many people, and myself included, it can come out in a lot of somatic ways. It can be pain, it can be discomfort, it could be GI, it could be migraines and headaches. And I think that's sort of the interesting thing and the complex thing of working with grief is it's not one thing in one way. Pain, discomfort, of course, it can impact sleep, our connection with others. I think overall, because on the zoom out, it's impacting how you see yourself and this world and life. And when something can impact something so broad as that, there's nothing underneath, it couldn't impact as well.
Mhm. I totally agree, and I think they can feel so earth-shattering, and so it's not just going to affect our emotions, feeling sad, feeling, the grieving process, we know, and all of you listening, there's going to be, as always, a lot of resources attached to this, and there's the stages of grieving, right? There's, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and then there's issues with guilt if it's, prolonged enough, which I think we'll get into later, so that's an important subtopic. But all of those things compounded, it's not just this emotional process, and it very much is. It's not just a cognitive process of, these thoughts and ruminations. It's often our bodies. I know when a lot of my clients know, and people that know me personally know that, I've lost both my parents to cancer. And with both of them, it was a lot of migraines, and I actually ended up having a lot of panic attacks that I'd never had before, and they were very scary. Like, people, and I've worked with a lot of clients that go through panic attacks, and was like, "What is going on?" And I remember my primary care provider and my therapist were like, "No, you're having panic attacks because your body's going through the grieving process." And I see that a lot too. And I think, we think of the sadness and, crying and all that stuff, and that's what's kind of seen on the media. But I think what we need to really, maybe normalize in our discussion today is that the impact that it has on our body, those somatic complaints. So yeah, stomach issues, right? Going from, a raccoon in a trash can to not, right? And, for me, I was always pretty like, I was always, I think we all have like traits of certain things. I was probably not the most unanxious person in the world, but I certainly wasn't having panic attacks. And that it was temporary. With therapy, I got through it. But I think it's something I see clinically a lot too, of the changes in the body that are the most scary for people. And it's why I think people delay that grief process, is it's a really scary thing to deal with when you're not only your emotions and your mind is wandering and going in these uncharted territories, but your body feels like it's not yourself.
Absolutely.
No more imposter syndrome. Compass Psychological Services helps you build greater self confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Our stories parallel a lot there because while my dad was slowly dying of cancer, that I was also having panic attacks in school. And I remember, it was the 90s at that time. So, I thought I was having a heart attack. There was no conversations of mental health. I was wearing a heart monitor in high school. And I remember the moment where a cardiologist is like, "Why are you doing this?" And I like broke down crying. And that's when they were like, "Yeah, maybe you should talk to a therapist or something like that." Which at that time, again, I'd never heard of somebody talking to a therapist. It wasn't common in Ohio in in the late 90s. But that process, same. It was just speaking openly and authentically about all the things I was experiencing, with my dad having brain cancer that I had suppressed and bottled down. And I think, there's not a right way to do grief, but I also know we have enough literature and data and research to support if you're suppressing anything, and that means anything. It could be sadness, could be anger, could be, that bargaining where you're like, what if this, what if that, or what if we could do this differently. If you're suppressing anything, it's building up stress and cortisol in our bodies, which once that happens, anything's pretty much on the table, from GI to migraine to tension in the body, panic, but it's hard. I think that's the thing that all of us know who have gone through grief is it feels easier to avoid. And it feels easier to be like, I just want to go back to whatever a normal life was, before this grief process started for me.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it's that acceptance, right? If we accept it, then it's really real. And that person or that thing is really gone. And I totally agree with something you said a minute ago with it's not linear,
Hmm.
right? I think people, the stages of grieving book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is, talks about how it's not,
Right.
it's often starts with denial of the shock of something happening, and then the anger of why is this happening to me, right? And then, like you said, the bargaining, the depression we talk about a lot with grief because that's what's I think really kind of the stereotype of grief is the depression phase, and then the acceptance, and then if prolonged enough, the issues of guilt. But those things that can happen, grief is complicated. Grief is very messy and very chaotic, and or at least I'm speaking from my experience, but personally, and then from what I see professionally, I work a lot with individuals who have gone through or going through the grief process and loss. And so healing is going to be similar, isn't it? It's not going to be this like very like, textbook clean process. It's going to be messy as hell. And I think that a lot of people are shocked and maybe intimidated by that, rightly so.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up because this is one of those things where I wish it's not to critique, but I wish we could edit and call it like cycles of grief.
Yes.
Because stages definitely make it feel like stage one, stage two, which is again Kubler-Ross has talked about many times. Like, oh well, it wasn't meant to be changes or stages and linear, and I'm like, then maybe we just need to edit this word out.
Right.
Not to
Yeah.
not to critique too
Maybe
hard.
we've outgrown it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm with you. It's like even it's been, God, like over 15 years since my dad passed. And I'll still have a day or two or some hours where I'm right back into bargaining. And I'm like, yeah, what if we had the cancer treatments we had today? Like, what if we've been open to that last trial? And it doesn't mean like, oh, I've done this whole grieving thing wrong. Like I'm back to stage one. It's like, no, not at all. That's just the realities of grief. And I think, and I've heard this said so many different ways, but like in the beginning, grief does feel like a tidal wave. Like it's crashing over you, you're tumbling in it, you can't get any footing, it's hard to stay in your life at the surface. It's like you're just being swept away by it. And I think a lot of people's experience, and definitely mine, is like as time goes on, as we lean towards it, as we talk about it, as we explore and process, the waves come a lot less rampant and they're a lot less rough. They're smaller. It's like the ocean begins to flatten out a bit, but they're still there. You never remove the waves out of the ocean. And that to me is a metaphor that has always been like, yeah, that makes sense to me with grief. It's like the waves are never completely gone. The height of them, the strength of them, the frequency of them sort of dissipates, but like I'll still have a day, around a birthday. My dad died right after Christmas. There's just some years you feel it. You're like, nah, here comes the wave.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, we talk a lot, I think, about, and we've experienced, or I've experienced personally, holidays and anniversaries. My mother passed away while I was in grad school.
Mm.
So that was not fun. And if you would have told me I would have been able to talk to my clients about grief, I would have been like, I will break down. Okay, well, it will not, it's a no subject, right?
Right.
But, now I, with a decent amount of confidence, like talk to people, not every client, but clients that are going through grief. I go, I've, eventually I say, I've also lost, a parent or two, right? To, cancer specifically. But it's really a tool to be like, hey, I hear you, right? Because I think
Mhm.
a lot of people who are going through a loss wonder if that person can really understand them and really relate to what's going on. Because I think, I mean, at least I felt this personally, and I've had clients kind of, be like, I'm so sick of people not understanding me or, trying to placate. And I think it's really, really important, to know that, you're not alone in this. And I think that our country seems to have a lot a lot of opportunities for change to make it more of a, like, okay process, right? It's such a unique process. It's so weird, right? Because grief is so universal. It's going to touch us all at some point, or maybe many points, some earlier than others. And yet, it's such a personal process. And so I think it's something that has such a dichotomy to it that a lot of people, at least in our culture here in the US, have a hard time kind of addressing. I know for me, I was in grad school to be a clinical psychologist, so I had some good people around me. I was in therapy, and a lot of people were like, very validating and very, held the space for me. But I remember when I was in my freshman year of undergrad when my dad died of cancer. It was like people, you mention it, and people's eyes get huge and like, they suck in air and they're like, oh, they're in a better place, right?
Sure.
Or,
Yeah.
or it's like, wait, what? No, I don't, depending on your beliefs, all of them are valid, right? Everybody's beliefs are valid, but what if somebody doesn't believe that, right? Or
Mhm.
what if you just want them here, right? It's cool that maybe they're in a cool place, but I want them here with me, right? And this whole concept of for people who are listening and witnessing someone going through grief, right? Don't invalidate, don't placate, don't overlook, because I think a lot of that is we're uncomfortable with grief, and so we get scared to hold that space. I'm so curious what your thoughts are on that.
I agree. Like overall, I think it's just our own discomfort. And like I think there's something unique that does happen when you've been through grief because I had a unique story that like one of my best friends in undergrad had lost his dad to cancer just 4 months before mine died. And I distinctly remember like handling that really badly as his friend, like in retrospect. Like, I kinda avoided it. I tried to keep him busy. I certainly spent the time, but I felt like a lot of people did of, like, I don't know what to say. And it was so interesting after my dad passed. I'm like, "Oh, saying anything minus, like, placating of, like" yeah, kinda like you mentioned, "They're in a better place," or this and that. Um, Saying anything is usually better than nothing. And there's individual differences and, each unique person again could want something different, which I think the cool place to start is like, "Hey, what are you needing right now?" Because for one person, hey, there's somebody out there who probably does need to hear they're in a better place. That might actually help them. I know for me, the silence was deafening. And I'm like, yo, I had just done this to one of my best friends months before because I'm like, oh, it's awkward. Like it felt awkward.
Right. Uncomfortable. Yeah.
But I think starting from a place of like, "Hey, what are you needing?" And just being able to listen, and for me, that's all I wanted is, like, to have some space where I could talk about my dad, where someone wouldn't, like, pivot the conversation instantly because of discomfort. I can think of the people who did that for me, who would sit with me in that space and just be like, yeah, like, "So how are you doing today? Like, what's coming up for you?" Like, all those things went a long way because you can't undo it, and we're a country, and especially American culture, we wanna fix everything, and grief is an interesting thing of, like, you can't undo it, there's no fixing. It's having people that can connect with you along that journey.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that, it's one of those things that it's normalizing the process because we're all going to go through it. And sometimes it's hard to know how to approach this. And I don't think any of us do it perfectly, whether we're witnessing grief or or the people going through it. It's like I think what like we both agreed on, it's very messy and chaotic. And it's always like that. You're right. The waves get a little, you know, uh they get smoother over the years, but then you have to watch out for those holidays, those memories, those triggers, and just knowing that it's about balance and recalibration every day, I feel like. And based on your culture, your family system, the grief process is going to look different, it's going to feel different. But I think that because of a lot of societal expectations and pressures, to kind of circle back to the grief process, right, or the grief stages, it's almost like there's a time limit on, or expiration date on, how long we can grieve. Like, even if you look at, the research, it says like, "Oh, prolonged grief or bereavement disorder," right? If you look at the DSM, and, it's by the way, just because I love looking up research stuff. It's kind of the point of this podcast is to have awesome guests on like you that are experts on your field and then also do my work on the research too. It's kind of why I'm doing this whole deal. Um, but the definition of complicated and prolonged grief is a year or more of grieving, which sounds so little to me, first of all. So that's point number one. And by the way, this whole prolonged, complicated grief happens in at least a fifth of grieving cases. So that's, I think, probably so underreported. And by the way, just calling myself out, like my father passed away in '06, and I'm still like, I can listen to the Beatles now, but I still get teary eyed, around, like his birthday and things like that. Yes, now I can talk about it without like losing my marbles, right? And being really triggered. But, it's still tough. That's like, we're almost 20 years into this for me, right? It's really hard. And, just like you, in a way, my mother passed away right before Christmas. And so Christmas is complicated. I know we both have kids and, it's wonderful and beautiful for our small children. And then we think of, oh, the grandparents that aren't there, right? Around a holiday that's supposed to be very happy and shoved down our throats, of very blissful, right? And so I'm way past that year mark. So I guess to go back to it, as I'm curious what you think, why is there expiration date on grief? What do you think that's about?
Even the most successful couples can have breakdowns in communication. However, Compass Psychological Services provides tools to help navigate these pressures together.
Insurance. Like if we cut to
Yeah,
the chase. I mean,
yeah,
diagnostics is just about insurance covering and
yeah.
paying for something. But I mean,
The
yeah,
moment,
that's the
yeah,
why. Certain things in the DSM have, oh, if you've had this symptom for 12
right.
days, it's not enough. If it's 14 days, your
Right.
insurance will cover it
Then you're
though.
good. So just hold on for 2 more days.
Hold on. That way you don't have to pay out of pocket. No, the system is ludicrous. Like, listen, I think there can be cool things that happen through factor analysis and statistical processes that show us certain symptom clusters, which is what we've made out of the DSM. But its existence and all of us in practice know this is just a way for insurance to cover things, which shows a broken system in so many different ways. Um, but I also think like we in American culture, we have a society that is really uncomfortable with emotions and think emotions are a problem. And not every culture is that way. Like, I think there's far more authentic cultures that we can cry because 'cause we're feeling sad. This is a sad thing. Or we can be angry because 'cause we're like, "Dang, I'm getting fired up." I had a flashback of my brother and how he passed. I just feel, like, on edge and irritable and angry today. But we live in a culture of masking where corporate America
Mhm.
dictates that you gotta keep your stuff
Yeah,
together.
your game face
And
on.
so put that corporate face on and go to work, and again, this is just very American of us, that you're not allowed to feel something. And I think it's a shame, and I think as much as mental health in general has reduced stigma, we got a long way to go. And just having the authenticity that none of us always have our shit together. And when it comes to something as complicated as grief, if we were more open and accepting, we'd be like, yeah, people can have their emotions and we can come alongside. And not everything has to be like, oh, better involve HR because someone has an emotion on the floor today and keep
Like,
it like
uh-oh.
6. Yeah, yeah, but these are especially I get real cynical because I work with a lot of clients and who work in corporate America, and I think just the handling of emotions and general mental health is so poor in America.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because I feel like we're so tied into that hustle culture in the, I call it the struggle Olympics because, so many people are like, oh, I did this. I worked for 15 hours yesterday, right? Oh, I got 2 hours of
Mm,
sleep. And it's like, oh, well, that's not helping your, like anything for you.
nope.
And it's tough because if you look at some of the stats that I found, like 2.5 million people die in the US annually, right? Which I'm sure it's way more than that. Um, each leaves behind an average of 5 grieving people. And so that's probably underreported. So
Sure.
let's just assume that that is because, I know assuming is not great, but, a lot of things are underreported.
Yeah.
Um, you know, There's over 1.5 million children, which is 5% of children in the US who have lost one or more parents by the age of 15. 57% of Americans report experiencing a major loss over the last 3 years. 32% of people have lost a family member or a close friend. I mean, I could go on and on, right? There's loss of children, there's loss of a pet, loss of a spouse or partner. There's a lot of ways that we lose people, right? And so this number is so great that yet we still have not created a system, right, that greatly and effectively supports these people in an adequate way. I think we definitely have agreed on that today. What are some ways that you would recommend someone personally and, as a psychologist, start that process of addressing their grief, or maybe pick back up on that process that they've left behind? What would you suggest to them?
Compass Psychological Services helps you manage stress and maintain a healthy work life balance.
There's a lot of different ways you can go about it. I'm very much being an interpersonal process therapist. I'm very much knowing we're a social species. We don't do anything well in isolation, which is why we're in this epidemic of isolation right now, through COVID and beyond. But I'm a big believer to find the people, spaces, and places where you can talk about it. And at its essence, we avoid because of vulnerability. Vulnerability is hard. It's hard speaking about the things that you've stuffed down for months, if not years. Like, all of us feel that. I feel that in my own therapy of like something that I've been thinking about talking about for a while, and you feel the discomfort kind of radiate through your body. But again, that release we know is good for you, to connect with another person and be truly seen in your story. It's real important. Do I know that some people aren't there yet to explore, whether it's with a mental health professional, a bestie, you know, your work wife or husband, which is maybe another topic for another podcast, but whoever it is, I know.
Come back on for that later.
Come back on that. The dynamics that happen in the workforce are fascinating, but I think a good place for some people to start, if they're not there to connect with another, is journaling.
Mhm,
And, I've had clients do all the things from leaving voice notes from a memory that
mhm,
popped up to, of
mhm,
course, classic writing it out in a journal to
mhm.
adding it to your notes in your
Yeah.
phone. There's no right or wrong way to express it, but we also
Mhm,
know expressing it outwardly in sort of a documentary,
mhm.
style is good for you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was, to prep for today, I was kind of reviewing some of the literature as I say all the time because I love it. It's fun for me. Maybe it's one of my self-care things, but
I love it.
um, giving me a sense of control in the uncontrollable world, right?
Amen. Right.
But, it was interesting. A lot of the treatments that have come out are more, we're starting to, like, as clinicians, kind of speaking, as a clinician now, is more towards, gearing it more towards trauma work.
Mm.
More of the successful outcomes are, I'm also a big interpersonal process, gal. And I love that. And it's what they're also is effective as more trauma work. The whole that wonderful book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? A lot of things that we've learned with trauma is we keep a lot of trauma in our body, and we also keep a lot of grief in our body. So, yes, the journaling, the getting it out, if you're an artsy person, getting it out in creative ways. I had a client a few years ago. His father passed away, and they were both really into, I think, Star Wars or Star Trek. I'm sorry for listeners. I sometimes get confused on the two. I'm really sorry. But it was the one with the big ship. And so he finished the project.
Mm.
And that was part of our therapy, is processing. It was like a big thing with Legos. You and I both know what Legos are as parents, and they're fun to step on and they're very intricate, right? And it was this huge ship. And then when he was done, he just had this enormous cathartic cry because he was finishing something that they started. And so I think the meaning making is also really important, is getting it out, whether it's verbally, artistically, writing things, and also, getting it out of your body so it's not creating an abscess within you emotionally and physically, I think is really important. But yeah, I think just knowing where to go is really important too. So I'll put some cool links in this episode of where to get started. But I think just knowing that people are not alone is really important too.
Always. And there's plenty of groups. I think that's one of the things we do well, is like generally in most communities, there's a grief and loss process group. And that's something I wouldn't want people to minimize. That being around other people who are experiencing it can add a lot of connection that you may not necessarily get from an individual therapist or a friend.
Right. Exactly. Because we can't guarantee that your clinician or your friend has also gone through a loss.
Right.
And, a lot of, I know hospice has a lot of great resources and a lot of other places. So sometimes the primary care provider is where to start as well if you don't have a therapist. Anyway, I'll link some stuff to this episode. But Dr. Justin, thank you so much. I know you're not a stranger to social media and to podcasts. So thank you so much for coming on today. We appreciate you so much and hope to have you back.
I'll be back anytime, Dr. Laura. Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye, everyone. This is Dr. Laura signing off with Mind Candy, and don't forget to hit subscribe.
Hey everyone, it's Dr. Laura with Mind Candy. A quick note just to discuss, as I am an ethical gal, ethical psychologist, none of these subjects or the information in the podcast constitute any kind of therapeutic relationship. All of that information can be found in our terms and conditions. Everything we discuss on Mind Candy are the experience of myself and my guests, and it does not constitute advice or a therapeutic relationship. Thank you so much. And don't forget to hit subscribe.